3 days of fighting had broken the men of Dale. Brand, king of Dale, lay dead on the field before the gates of Erebor. Dáin Ironfoot stood over the body of his ally, fighting with his axe, while Easterling forces drove the defenders back towards the mountain. He was more than 250 years old. He died there beside Brand before the gates of the lonely mountain. The survivors retreated inside. The enemy besieged them. The War of the Ring was reaching Minas Tirith at the same time. No Dwarven army stood on the Pelennor fields. No Dwarven host marched to the aid of Gondor. The question seems obvious. If the War of the Ring was a war for the survival of the West, where were the dwarves? The answer is geographical and military. The dwarves were fighting Sauron's northern war at home, and the result could have decided whether Mordor attacked the West from behind. The main narrative of The Lord of the Rings follows Frodo Baggins and the Fellowship. It moves south from Rivendell through Moria, Lothlorien and Rohan, into Gondor and Mordor. The northern theatre of the war stays almost entirely off-screen. Tolkien describes it in the appendices, not in the main text. Appendix A and Appendix B carry the account of what happened at Erebor and Dale while the Fellowship travelled south. To answer where the dwarves were, 5 places matter. Erebor, the lonely mountain, the restored dwarven kingdom under Dáin Ironfoot. Dale, the city of men rebuilt after Smaug's death. Moria, or Khazad-dûm, the ancient dwarven city under the misty mountains, lost to orcs and something worse. Rivendell, where Elrond held council in October of TA 3018. And Aglarond, the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, where Gimli would later found a colony. The war touched each of these places. The dwarves did not sit out the conflict. They fought it on their own border. Mordor had already turned its attention to Erebor before the War of the Ring began. A messenger came to the lonely mountain asking questions. The questions were about a hobbit named Baggins and a place called the Shire. The offer that came with those questions would shape Dáin's response. In TA 3018, a messenger from Mordor arrived at Erebor. He came from Sauron. He asked Dáin Ironfoot for news of Baggins and the Shire. He offered payment. The payment was the last 3 of the 7 dwarf rings, the rings of power that Sauron had gathered or recovered over centuries. He promised to return them to the dwarves if Dáin cooperated. Dáin did not cooperate. He did not refuse outright either. He delayed. He sent the messenger away, saying he needed time to consider. The messenger returned twice more, each time pressing harder, each time offering more. The final offer included the 3 rings and friendship with Sauron if Dáin would help find the hobbit. If Dáin refused, the messenger said things would go badly for the dwarves. Dáin faced a decision. He could not fight Mordor alone. He could not trust Sauron's offer. He could not keep delaying forever. He chose to send a delegation to Rivendell. Glóin, one of the dwarves who had travelled with Thorin Oakenshield to the Lonely Mountain decades earlier, made the journey. His son Gimli went with him. The delegation was small, 2 dwarves on the road, representing a kingdom. Their purpose was to seek Elrond's counsel and to warn Bilbo Baggins that Sauron was looking for him. They carried news of the messenger's offer and the threat behind it. They arrived at Rivendell in October, just as the Council of Elrond was about to meet. The contrast is sharp. A kingdom of dwarves sat in the north under pressure, facing a threat from Mordor that would arrive at its gates within a year. 2 of its people travelled south to a hidden valley to ask for help. The army that would fight Sauron's northern campaign was already in the place where the war would reach it. It was in Erebor. It was in Dale. It was not marching south. Before the messenger came, before the Council of Elrond, before the War of the Ring began, Dáin had already made one decision about a dwarven expedition that ended in disaster. That decision concerned Moria. In TA 2989, Balin left Erebor with a group of dwarves to reclaim Khazad-dûm. Moria was the greatest of all dwarven cities, built under the misty mountains by Durin and his people. It had been abandoned after the dwarves dug too deep and woke Durin's bane of Balrog in the deep places of the earth. That was generations earlier. Orcs have since occupied the lower halls. Balin believed he could take it back. He did, for a time. The colony established itself. Balin became lord of Moria. The dwarves found old treasures and began to rebuild. For 5 years the expedition seemed to succeed. Then the colony was destroyed. Orcs came up from the deep places and overwhelmed the dwarves. Balin was killed. The survivors were trapped and cut off. The last record of the colony is the Book of Mazarbul, a record kept in the Chamber of Mazarbul, which the Fellowship later found. Gimli saw Balin's tomb there. Gandalf read the book. The final entry described the sound of drums in the deep and the coming of orcs. Then the record stopped. Moria was an orc-held ruin. It was not a dwarven reserve. It supplied no army. It sent no reinforcements to Erebor or to the War of the Ring. The Fellowship passed through it and found orcs, a Balrog, and the tomb of a failed expedition. Dáin had reasons to refuse reclamation of Moria before Balin ever tried. He had been at the Battle of Azanulbizar in TA 2799, the final battle of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. He had fought there as a young dwarf. He had seen Azog killed at the gate of Moria. And he had seen something else. He had seen Durin's bane. He knew what lived in Khazad-dûm. When Balin proposed the expedition, Dáin gave permission, but without enthusiasm. He had seen the Balrog. He did not believe Moria could be held. Now the lack of a safe central fortress mattered. The dwarves had Erebor in the east. They had settlements in the Iron Hills. They had kin in the Blue Mountains far to the west. The record does not say what those distant settlements did during the War of the Ring, but between Erebor and the Blue Mountains, the Misty Mountains stood, and beneath them Moria was lost. The dwarves had no fortress in the center of Middle-earth. They had no safe road through the mountains. They had a restored kingdom in the north and scattered kin elsewhere. When the war came, the kingdom in the north would bear the weight. Erebor was that kingdom. To understand why Sauron targeted it, it helps to understand what had been rebuilt there. Smaug had sacked Erebor in TA 2770. The dragon destroyed Dale and drove the dwarves out. For nearly 200 years the lonely mountain sat empty, a hoard of gold guarded by a dragon. That changed in TA 2941. Thorin Oakenshiel's company travelled to the mountain. Smaug died, killed by Bard the bowman of Lake Town. The battle of 5 armies followed, and Dáin Ironfoot came from the Iron Hills with a dwarven army. After Thorin's death in that battle, Dáin became king under the mountain. Dáin ruled well. Dale was rebuilt. Bard became king of Dale. The men and dwarves lived in friendship, as they had before Smaug. Trade returned. The roads between Erebor and Dale carried goods again. The Iron Hills remained connected to Erebor through kinship and alliance. The men of the lake, the Northmen of the surrounding lands, and the woodland realm of Thranduil in Mirkwood all had dealings with the restored kingdom. Erebor had walls, gates, and roads. It had a population of dwarves working forges and mines. It had an allied city of men at its feet. It had trade routes running east to the Iron Hills and south toward the lands of men. It was a functioning kingdom, with borders to protect and people to defend. Its prosperity made it valuable. Its location made it a target. The lonely mountain sat in the northeast of Middle-earth, near the river Carnan and the lands that connected to Mordor's eastern allies. If Sauron could take Erebor, he could control the north. If he could draw its forces into a fight, he could prevent them from interfering elsewhere. The restored kingdom was a strategic asset for the west and a strategic obstacle for Mordor. While Erebor prepared for the threat from the east, one dwarf from the lonely mountain travelled south and into the story the main narrative tells. They came to warn Bilbo and seek Elrond's counsel. They found the counsel of Elrond instead. Glóin told the council about the messenger from Mordor, the offer of the 3 dwarf rings, and the threat to Erebor. Gimli listened. When the council debated the fate of the One Ring, Gimli spoke as a representative of the Dwarves of Erebor. He joined the Fellowship as its only dwarf. Gimli's journey carried him through the same war that was about to reach his home. He travelled with the Fellowship south from Rivendell. He entered Moria and saw Balin's tomb. He read the record of the colonists' fall. He fought orcs in the dark halls of Khazad-dûm. He lost Gandalf to the Balrog on the bridge. He walked through Lothlorien with the Fellowship and met Galadriel. He travelled down the Anduin, past the Argonath to Parth Galen. After the Fellowship broke, he followed Aragorn, Legolas, and the trail of the Uruk-hai across Rohan. He fought at Helm's Deep. He saw the glittering caves of Aglarond behind the Deeping Wall and marvelled at them. He walked the paths of the dead with Aragorn. He rode to the Pelennor fields on the ships of the Corsairs, now taken by Aragorn. He fought at the Battle of the Morannon, the Black Gate, where the armies of the west drew Sauron's eye while Frodo reached Mount Doom. Gimli's service was real. It was the service of one dwarf, not the service of Erebor's army. His presence in the south did not mean the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain marched with him. He had left Erebor as part of a delegation of 2. The army of Erebor stayed in the north. It was about to need every soldier it had. While Gimli fought at Helm's Deep and walked the paths of the dead, the war reached Erebor. The the Easterlings crossed the river Carnan. The northern front opened. The Easterlings were men from the east, allies of Sauron. They came across the river Carnan, the red water, which ran south from the Iron Hills toward the Sea of Rhûn. Tolkien does not name their commander. He does not give their numbers. He does not describe their banners or their specific leaders. He says they came in force, allied with Sauron, and they attacked the lands of Dale and Erebor. Brand, king of Dale, met them. He was the grandson of Bard the Bowman, the slayer of Smaug. He ruled Dale and the surrounding lands of the Northmen. He fought the Easterlings and was driven back. The enemy pushed him toward the mountain. Brand retreated to Dale, the city at the foot of Erebor, and prepared to hold it. Dáin Ironfoot came to his aid. The king under the mountain led an army of dwarves out of Erebor to support Brand and the men of Dale. Tolkien does not give the size of Dáin's army. He does not provide a census of the dwarves in Erebor or a complete northern order of battle. He says Dáin came with an army and that the dwarves and men fought together. The Battle of Dale lasted 3 days. The fighting took place in the streets of Dale and on the fields before the gates of Erebor. Brand and Dáin fought side by side. The Easterlings pressed them. The defenders were outnumbered or outmatched, though the record does not say by how much. On the first day, the Easterlings forced Brand back through Dale. The dwarves held the approaches to the mountain. The fighting was close and hard. The city streets became a battlefield. On the second day, the Easterlings pushed deeper into Dale. The defenders fell back toward the mountain. The gates of Erebor were behind them. The dwarves made their stand in the narrowing ground between the city and the mountain's entrance. On the third day, Brand was slain. The record does not say who killed him or how he fell. It says he died fighting. Dáin Ironfoot, king under the mountain, stood over Brand's body and defended it. He was old. The account places his age at more than 250 years. He fought with his axe, and he killed many enemies before he fell. He died before the gates of Erebor, beside the body of Brand, king of Dale. Tolkien does not name Dáin's killer. He does not describe the moment in detail. He says Dáin fell defending Brand's body, and that the dwarves and men were driven back into the mountain. The survivors retreated inside Erebor. The gates were shut. The Easterlings besieged the mountain. The dwarves and the remaining men of Dale were trapped inside. The enemy held the city and the fields. The mountain was surrounded. The question was whether the closed gate could hold. Erebor was a fortress carved into a mountain. Its gates were strong, its halls were deep. But the defenders were besieged. Their kings were dead. Brand had fallen. Dáin had fallen. Leadership passed to their sons. Thorin III Stonehelm, Dáin's son, became king under the mountain. Bard II, Brand's son, became king of Dale. Both were inside the mountain, surrounded with an enemy army at the gates. The siege held. The Easterlings could not take the mountain. But the dwarves and men inside could not break out. They were contained. And while they were contained, the war in the south reached its height. The siege of Erebor was not a separate conflict. It was part of the War of the Ring, and its outcome mattered to the war in the south. Gandalf said so. In Appendix A, Tolkien records Gandalf's assessment of the northern battle and its strategic significance. Gandalf said that if the Easterlings had defeated the dwarves and men of Dale completely, if they had taken Erebor and destroyed the northern defense, Sauron's forces could have moved south and west. They could have joined the attacks from Dol Guldur against the woodland realm of Thranduil and against Lothlorien. The northern front would have collapsed. Sauron's armies could have threatened the west from the north and from the rear, while Gondor and Rohan fought in the south. This is Gandalf's counterfactual. It is a strategic assessment, not an omniscient battle statistic. It says what could have happened if the northern defense had failed. The dwarves and men of Dale did not win the Battle of Dale. They lost it. Their kings were dead. They were besieged, but they held the mountain. They contained the Easterling force. They kept a large enemy army occupied in the north while the war in the south was decided. The Easterlings tied to Erebor could not reinforce the Pelennor. They could not march to the Black Gate. They could not attack Lothlorien or the woodland realm from the north. They were stuck at the gates of the lonely mountain, fighting a siege that lasted weeks. The defense of Erebor was costly. Dáin was dead. Brand was dead. The army of dwarves had taken losses. The men of Dale had been broken, but the mountain held. The enemy was contained, and while the siege continued, the ring travelled toward Mount Doom. The siege of Erebor was still unresolved when the war turned. Frodo reached Mount Doom. the One Ring was destroyed. Sauron fell, his power collapsed, the armies of Mordor broke, the eye of Sauron was extinguished, and in the north the Easterlings learned that the war was lost. After the destruction of the ring and the fall of Sauron, the Easterlings besieging Erebor lost their master. Sauron's will had driven them, his power had organized them. When that power vanished, they did not simply go home, but they were shaken. Their cause was broken. Thorin III, Stonehelm, and Bard II led their people out of Erebor. The gates opened. The dwarves and the remaining men of Dale attacked the Easterlings. The enemy, now without the direction of Sauron's will, broke. Thorin III and Bard II routed them. The Easterlings were defeated. The siege was lifted. Dale was retaken. Tolkien does not describe this battle in detail. He does not give the numbers or the tactics. He says the dwarves and men came out of the mountain and defeated the enemy after Sauron fell. The Northern War ended in victory, but it was a victory bought with the lives of 2 kings. The Battle of Dale mattered. It held a major enemy force in the north, while Gondor fought in the south. It prevented Sauron from using the Easterlings against Lothlorien, the woodland realm, or the rear of the western armies. It cost the dwarves their king. It cost Dale its king, and it kept the lonely mountain from falling into Sauron's hands. No dwarven army marched to Minas Tirith because the dwarves were fighting at Erebor. Dáin Ironfoot died before the gates of the lonely mountain, defending the body of Brand, king of Dale. The army of Erebor was besieged inside the mountain, while the Pelennor fields were fought. The dwarves did not sit out the war. They fought it where it reached them. Moria stayed lost during the War of the Ring. Banin's colony was destroyed. Orcs held Khazad-dûm. The Fellowship passed through and found the tomb and the book. Moria supplied no army because it had no dwarves left to supply. The record does not say when the dwarves reclaimed it, though Tolkien suggests that Durin's folk would eventually return. After the war, the dwarves helped rebuild what had been broken. They worked on the gates of Minas Tirith, replacing what the siege had destroyed with mithril and steel. They helped restore Helm's Deep. Gimli led a colony of dwarves to the glittering caves of Aglarond, the caves he had seen during the Battle of Helm's Deep. He became lord of the glittering caves. The dwarves of Aglarond and the dwarves of Erebor remained connected, 2 settlements in a world that was healing. The War of the Ring was fought on many fronts. The Fellowship carried the ring south. Gondor held the Pelennor. Rohan rode to the aid of Minas Tirith. And in the north, the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale fought a battle that most readers of the main story never see. They fought it at home. They fought it at the gates of the lonely mountain. They lost their kings and held their ground. The dwarves were where the war reached them. The road from Erebor to Minas Tirith ran more than 1,000 miles south and west. It crossed the river Carnan, passed through the lands of the Northmen, skirted the edges of Mirkwood, and wound through the gap between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains. An army marching that distance would need weeks. It would need supply lines, clear roads, and safe passage through territory that Sauron's allies controlled. The dwarves of Erebor had none of those things in TA 3019. They had an enemy army at their gates. Dáin Ironfoot knew the messenger from Mordor was not making an offer. He was issuing a demand disguised as a negotiation. The 3 dwarf rings were bait. Sauron held them, or claimed to hold them, and dangled them before a king who knew exactly what they had cost his people. The 7 rings had corrupted the dwarves' ancestors, inflating their greed and feeding their anger. By the time Sauron gathered them, most were destroyed by dragonfire or recovered by force. The last 3 were symbols of loss, not gifts. Dáin understood this. He delayed because delay was the only tool he had. He could not fight Mordor. He could not trust Mordor. He could buy time and seek counsel, and that is what he did. Glóin carried the weight of that decision to Rivendell. He was old enough to remember Smaug and the Battle of 5 Armies. He had walked the road from the Iron Hills to Erebor with Dane's army. He had seen Thorin Oakenshield die on the field before the mountain. Now he sat in Elrond's house and told a council of elves, men and hobbits, that a messenger from Sauron had come to his king's hall, asking about a hobbit named Baggins. The connection must have seemed strange to the others at the council. A hobbit, the Shire. These were small things, far from Erebor, far from the politics of kings and rings. But Sauron's interest in Baggins told Glóin and Gimli something the council needed to hear. The enemy was searching for something. He believed a hobbit had it. He was willing to trade dwarf rings to find it. Gimli heard all of this. He was Glóin's son, a dwarf of Erebor, and he had come to Rivendell as part of a delegation of 2. When the council decided to destroy the One Ring, Gimli volunteered. He joined the fellowship not as a representative of an army, but as an individual. His father returned to Erebor. Gimli went south. The kingdom he left behind would face the war without him. The destruction of Balin's colony in Moria was less than 30 years old when the War of the Ring began. Balin had left Erebor in TA 2989 with a following of dwarves. They entered Khazad-dûm through the East Gate, the same gate where Dáin had seen Durin's Bane decades earlier at the Battle of Azan-ul-Bizar. The colony lasted 5 years. Balin died in TA 2994. The orcs came from the deep places, and the dwarves could not hold. The Book of Mazabul recorded the final days. It spoke of drums in the deep, of orcs coming through the gates, of the colony cut off from the world above. The last entry was unfinished. The fellowship found the book in the chamber of Mazabul. Gimli stood before Balin's tomb and wept. The tomb was in a room strewn with bones and broken weapons. The colony had died fighting. Moria was a grave. The orcs that held it were not a scattered remnant. They were organized, numerous, and they served something older and worse than themselves. The Balrog that Gandalf faced on the bridge was the same creature Dáin had glimpsed years before. It was Durin's Bane, the thing that had killed Durin Six and driven the dwarves from their greatest city. Dáin never forgot what he saw at Azan-ul-Bizar. He was young then. He had pursued Azog to the gate and watched the orc chieftain die. But beyond the gate, in the shadow of the mountain, something stood. Dáin would not enter. He returned to his people and said that Khazad-dûm could not be reclaimed, not while that thing remained. Balin tried anyway. The attempt failed. And when the War of the Ring came, Moria was a hole in the map, a stretch of darkness under the misty mountains that no dwarven army could cross. The geography of the war made this matter enormously. The misty mountains divided Middle-earth north to south. To pass from the eastern side to the western side, an army needed one of 3 routes: the high pass north of Rivendell, the Redhorn Pass near Moria, or the Gap of Rohan far to the south. The high pass was watched. The Redhorn Pass was blocked by snow and by what lived in Moria. The Gap of Rohan was long and exposed. The Dwarves of Erebor had no easy road west. Even if Dáin had wanted to send an army to Gondor, the route was dangerous and distant. The enemy held the east. The mountains held the center. The war in the south was a war the dwarves could reach only through great difficulty. Erebor's position was its strength and its burden. The lonely mountains stood in the northeast, near the river Carnan and the lands that fed into the trade routes of the Northmen. It was close to the Iron Hills, where Dáin had ruled before becoming king under the mountain. It was near Dale, the city of men that had been rebuilt after Smaug's death. The kingdom was prosperous. It had forges, mines, and storehouses. It had walls and gates carved into the mountain. It had a population that depended on those walls for safety. Sauron's strategy in the north was simple. Send the Easterlings to attack Erebor and Dale, tie down the dwarves and the Northmen, prevent them from interfering in the south. If the attack succeeded fully, the northern forces could be turned against Lothlorien or the Woodland Realm. If it failed to take the mountain, it would still hold the dwarves in place. Either way, Sauron won something. He kept a powerful ally of Gondor occupied while his main armies struck at Minas Tirith. The Easterlings crossed the Carnan and struck. Brand fought them and was driven back. Dáin came out of Erebor with an army. The 2 forces joined at Dale. 3 days of fighting followed. Brand fell. Dáin fell defending Brand's body before the gates. The survivors retreated inside. The siege began. Gandalf's assessment of what could have happened if the North fell is the key to understanding why the Battle of Dale mattered. He said that a northern defeat could have allowed Sauron's forces to link with the attacks from Dol Guldur. Dol Guldur was Sauron's old fortress in southern Mirkwood. During the War of the Ring, forces from Dol Guldur attacked the woodland realm of Thranduil and the Galadrim of Lothlorien. Those attacks were repelled, but they were serious. If the Easterlings had taken Erebor and destroyed the northern defense, their forces could have moved south and west. They could have reinforced Dol Guldur. They could have added weight to the attacks on Mirkwood and Lothlorien. The northern front would have folded into the southern front, and the west would have faced enemies from the north and the rear, while Gondor fought at the Pelennor. This is what the siege of Erebor prevented. The dwarves and men of Dale lost the battle. They lost their kings, but they held the mountain. The Easterlings could not move south. They could not reinforce Dol Guldur. They could not attack Lothlorien or the woodland realm from the north. They were stuck at the gates of Erebor, besieging a mountain they could not take, while the war in the south was decided without them. The siege lasted weeks. Inside the mountain, Thorin the Three Stonehelm and Bard Two waited. The dwarves had supplies. Erebor was built to withstand a siege. Its deep halls held food and water. Its forges could still work. But the defenders were cut off from the outside. No message came from the south. No help came from the west. They knew nothing of the Pelennor, of the ride of the Rohirrim, of Aragorn's path through the paths of the dead. They knew only that the enemy was at their gate and their kings were dead. Then Sauron fell. The ring was destroyed. The will that had driven the Easterlings broke, and the gates of Erebor opened. Thorin the Three Stonehelm came out. Bard Two came out with him. The dwarves and the men of Dale attacked the Easterlings. The enemy, broken by the loss of Sauron's power, could not hold. They were routed. The siege was lifted. Dale was retaken. The Northern War ended. The dwarves helped rebuild after the war. They worked on the gates of Minas Tirith, forging new doors of mithril and steel to replace those broken by the siege. They helped restore Helm's Deep. Gimli led a colony of dwarves to the glittering caves of Aglarond, the caves behind the beeping wall that he had seen during the Battle of Helm's Deep. He became lord of the glittering caves. The dwarves of Aglarond maintained ties with Erebor. Two settlements, one in the north and one in the south, connected by kinship and shared purpose. The record does not say what the dwarves of the Iron Hills did during the war. Tolkien does not provide a full account of every dwarven settlement. The Blue Mountains, where some of Durin's folk lived, are barely mentioned. The Iron Hills, Dáin's old domain, are not described in the War of the Ring, beyond their connection to Erebor. What the books give us is the lonely mountain, Dale, and the battle that was fought there. What they give us is Gimli, the one dwarf who walked south with the Fellowship. And what they give us is Gandalf's word that the north mattered. The dwarves were where the war reached them. They fought at Erebor. They fought at Dale. They lost their king and held their ground. The gate opened after the enemy heard that Sauron had fallen. And the dwarves walked out into a world that was still standing, because they had held the north while others held the south.